the level of technological infrastructure, you could say, that we have for the creation and transmission of culture is astounding. It would blow the minds of past generations to tell them what we have today. Streaming services, right? The ability to watch basically every movie ever made in your own home. The internet, which hypothetically can give us access to all of the culture, knowledge, research from antiquity to today at the tip of our fingers. Even something like digital music recording, making it possible for people to make music in their homes and just put it out there on the internet. If you were to tell someone in the past about all of this, they would have to assume we'd have had 6 more Renaissances by now. But really, what has it all actually amounted to? Largely a paywalled, subscription-based, ad-riddled, algorithmically controlled sludge machine. The technology which should make it possible to access all knowledge and art more and more just serves us stuff that no one actually wants. Ads, live-action Disney remakes, brain rot, more ads, and in general, content, not art, content designed to make you have a pleasurable, predictable experience that CEOs can be sure will sell. The profit-seeking logic of capital has seeped into the very fabric of our culture. Means of expression meant for communication between humans have become transmission belts for the interests of profit. Thank you for bringing some music and culture to my... Now, I don't want to exaggerate about the badness of everything. I actually don't think that everything that gets made is bad. I think particularly when it comes to television, film, and music, there are things being made with genuine artistic intent, which do get watched or listened to very widely. However, any artist actually trying to commit to a vision and actually get their art out there at the same time as being, committed to their actual intent, will have to contend with corporate interests. At every turn, there will be rich people in suits in boardrooms going, I'm just not sure if this will sell. Can we tone down this part? It's a little too weird, etc. And so artists are only really allowed to experiment insofar as it still seems like a profitable investment if they actually want the capital backing necessary to get their stuff out there. But at least in film, TV, and music, there is enough investment to keep these forms of art alive and somewhat dynamic, even if the shackles of the profit motive are always dragging along at its feet. Because there is a mass market for these things, stuff will get made one way or another. A lot of it will be slop, but things will get made, and not all of it will be slop. But where there is not a ready mass market, so for things like poetry, fiction, and visual art, like painting and so on, there have been decades of stagnation in these fields. It's not that nobody makes these kinds of art or makes them well. They do, but there's very little dynamism. Nothing really emerges as distinctly new or transgressive. I honestly think the last time that has really happened in these fields is about the 90s. I can tell you because I actually studied creative writing myself in university. I was expecting to find out what was going on, what was bubbling under the surface to be a part of in terms of new artistic movements, and I found it's the same. It's the same as from decades ago. Nothing emerges which marks a before and after in the development of the artistic field of which it's a part. And I do not count the sudden popularity of romantasy novels on TikTok as innovation. And so overall, in these fields, again, literature, art, there's very little going on that anyone outside of exclusive academic circles cares or knows about. So artistic production today is basically split between obtuse academic work, mostly meant for the amusement of other academics, and then mainstream mass market production, which requires the artist to forgo their own vision, or at least always be at risk of that, in favor of a studio or company or whoever is backing them. So there's basically the sellout option, which doesn't actually pay very well at all, and the option to keep your work within these academic circles, which also doesn't pay very well at all. And all of this, the steady stream of content and slop comprising an ever greater part of culture, the stagnation of literature and visual art, the impossibility of living as an artist in most fields, all of this is an indictment of the capitalist system. Marxists don't only care about wages and bread, we also care about what kind of life is left to live once you've had your bread. Otherwise, really, what would be the point of it all? Culture matters deeply to Marxists, both as something necessary to study in order to understand the society we live in, and as an important reason, I would say a moral reason, that we want to fight for a better world in the first place. To live in a society where culture can actually be for humans and not for profit. So the question then is, how do Marxists understand art? How does it relate to society as a whole? Now, often Marxists are accused of seeing art merely as a reflection of the economic base in society. And this is a caricature, but according to this caricature, understanding art for Marxists is very simple. You just have to see the economic conditions, perhaps the historical context it was made in, and now you understand that art, right? But this is a complete, as I said, made-up caricature of Marxist philosophy. We understand that there is more to art, and in fact more to all of human culture than just economic interests. Trotsky, who's a key leader of the Russian Revolution next to Lenin, and also an incredible art critic, I would even say theoretician. I would say you cannot talk about the Marxist understanding of art without talking about Trotsky. He openly ridiculed this idea that art can be reduced to a mere reflection of its material conditions. He said that if that were the case, then the true meaning of Dante's Divine Comedy could be found by calculating the price of Florentine cloth. Obviously, that's ridiculous. There is not such a direct relationship between the economic base of a society and the art produced in it. There is a whole tapestry of factors from all areas of society which mediate the relationship of art to economics. And Trotsky always maintained that art is more than just a historical document of the time, and it's wrong to interpret it as such. He said that a work of art should in the first place be judged by its own law, that is, by the law of art. But this begs the question, what is the law of art? Where does it come from? And this is a very important question. There's essentially two different philosophical approaches, two ways to answer this question. Either the law of art comes somehow from the real material world, or it doesn't, right? And so if art is not, in fact, a magical force separate from the world we live in, then it must in some way be subject to the economic laws that we live under in the real world. The question is, how? Now, Marx argued that there's a dialectical relationship between the economic base and the superstructure built on top of it. Ideas and culture do not only reflect that base, they also take on a logic of their own and can even sometimes act back upon the material base. One example would be the Enlightenment, in which the rising bourgeois class developed the ideas of liberty and equality that the masses would later go on to fight for in the French Revolution, making it a real material force in society. So clearly the ideas of the Enlightenment played a role. But those ideas in the first place were themselves born out of economic development. The Enlightenment was made possible due to the development of the productive forces that led to massive advances in science, therefore materially breaking down old religious prejudices and making way for new thought in the real world before people's eyes. And without that, we would not have gotten the movement that gave us, for example, the Sistine Chapel. It's not that the Sistine Chapel can be reduced to an expression of economics, but economics determined its very possibility by putting money into Michelangelo's hands, by setting about the construction of the church he painted on, by determining the building of the entire world around him. So art is not some magical, pure force separate from all the laws of the natural world, but it is part of humanity's struggle for meaning, knowledge, and expression, a struggle which itself takes place within the context of the class struggle. So to understand art, you need a comprehensive understanding of all of society. And that is why I believe Marxism gives us the fullest possible understanding of art. However, there's an idea very vogue in academia right now, and I would say in culture generally, which is that there are no laws at all in art. This is a key idea of postmodernism, which is dominant in universities, and it's the notion that all meaning, including in art, is totally subjective and individual. So from this perspective, there's no such thing as progress or stagnation in art. It's all in the eye of the beholder, and the idea of there being any objective way to look at art is simply elitist. But this idea, one, is useless for explaining anything, and two, justifies what has happened to art and culture today, its erosion by capital. And I don't accept the idea that we don't have a right to demand better and to demand a culture based on human expression. So we've spoken about how culture relates to society, how ideas relate to society, but what actually is culture? Now, Trotsky defined it as, quote, everything that has been created, built, learned, and conquered by man in distinction from what nature has given. Now, to concretize it a bit, Trotsky also reminds us that culture originally meant a plowed and cultivated field. So culture is how we raise ourselves above the bare laws of nature, above bare necessity, and actually interact with it and change it, remaking the world we live in based on the knowledge that we get from interacting with it. And so this is part of, I would say it's a defining feature of humanity, what separates us from other animals, because we are conscious beings who can learn, remember, and communicate. If you consider an early human teaching their child how to pick and sow seeds, as perhaps they were taught to do, but then maybe they learned even how to do it better, and to make more food than would appear naturally, this teaching is culture. And now art is part of this process, part of culture, but art, instead of helping us cultivate fields, helps us to cultivate ourselves. Take, for example, Shakespeare. Shakespeare changed the way, or you could say helped to change the way, that we actually understand humans, identity, what it is to be an individual. His characters brought forward the concept of the individual as distinct from the world around oneself, because he gave them much more rich inner worlds, right? These famous soliloquies that his characters do, like Hamlet, to be or not to be. Which was different. This kind of representation of the inner world of people had not really been seen before on page in this way. He showed humanity in a new way. He hit on something true about us that hadn't been expressed before, and this was a significant advance in art that laid the basis for even more development. And I think this kind of thing, these insights into the human experience, this is what Trotsky was talking about when he argued that art is a means of cognition, not just a way of inspiring certain moods, just a way to make you feel things, though that's obviously important. But, you know, Shakespeare's individuals didn't only make people feel things, they collectively taught us about ourselves by holding up a mirror to what we are. And that, in my opinion, is artistic culture at its best. Humanity collectively learning about itself, you can even say feeling its experience deeper, giving it more vocabulary to do so. But that's not all there is to culture, because culture is also a means of class rule. No ruling class in history has ever ruled by force alone, or at least not for long. In order for a minority to impose its rule over a majority, it needs ideas and institutions for those ideas to create some kind of acceptance of their rule in the minds of people. And culture, even art, is one way that the ruling class does this. Now, of course, the bourgeois are not constantly having meetings about how to justify their rule through art, but sometimes they are, actually. For example, during the Cold War, the United States Office of War Information met with Hollywood execs to discuss how cinema could be used to aid the war effort. The director of this office stated that, quote, "The easiest way to inject a propaganda idea into most people's minds is to let it go in through the medium of an entertainment picture when they do not realize that they are being propagandized." This collaboration between Hollywood and the US military continues to this day and has given us such gems as the Top Gun franchise and Call of Duty, the video game, which for some reason my computer advertises to me every time I turn it on. But by no means is, the attempt at class rule through culture always so obvious. It's usually not. And you could even say that Shakespeare's work could be said to be a tool of class rule. In some ways, it valorizes royalty, their exploits. It has all manner of problematic ideas in it. But does that mean it's nothing more than a defense of the ruling class's interests? No, because the plays still have this value as a means of cognition, still teach us about humanity in a way that to some extent is universal. Maya Angelou, speaking of Shakespeare, said, "I was prepared to believe that Shakespeare was really a black girl in the dirt roads of Arkansas. How else could he know? 500 years earlier, that white Englishman told my story." So Trotsky was always extremely scathing against those who wanted to simply dispense with all bourgeois art simply because it's bourgeois, right? Because this would actually mean the destruction of immense value for humanity as a whole, including the working class. So art always has a class basis, but it cannot be reduced to that. It also has its own function that to some extent transcends class. So therefore, as Marxists, we don't just look at art for its class basis and then deem it progressive or reactionary, good or bad, according to that. We are interested in understanding the progress of art and its movement, looking at it in its entire dialectical process. We are interested in what creates the kinds of revolutions in art that can help humanity look at itself differently and understand itself better. So the next question then is, how does art progress? This is obviously an extremely complicated question, but Trotsky, unsurprisingly, I think has the best possible way to summarize it. He said that artistic creation is always a complicated turning inside out of old forms under the influence of new stimuli which originate outside of art. So form, in this case, the turning inside out of old forms, form in art means how you express something. So how you lay a brush stroke, how you make a sentence. And art progresses when there are new developments in form. However, it's not random when or how those developments in form happen. They tend to happen when the world around artists has changed enough that the old forms, the old ways of expression, just don't work anymore. They then must be turned inside out. In other words, when there are new things to say, there also must be new ways of saying them. And those artists who find that way are really those who make their mark on human culture and who tend to be remembered for centuries to come. And now I think this approach, Trotsky's approach to art here, is very profound because it gives us a way to analyze art without resorting to abstract measures outside of space and time. You know, this rhyme scheme is the best for poetry objectively. It's not about that. That's not what it means to actually try to understand art. We look at the overall movement of art. And look for its impact in the real world, in society. A really progressive artistic movement, one that is really experimental, it leads to new developments in a given field of art. It provokes discussion. It makes its mark on culture. Yeah, okay. Now, I want to give an example of how this actually happens. And I think it's really important that we actually take diving into the content of art seriously if we want to say that we are doing a Marxist analysis of art. Trotsky said that dialectical materialism is not a master key to unlocking the meaning of all art. Would we ever talk about science that way? Would we ever talk about any other field of human activity that way? I don't think so, but you will see sometimes, especially from, I would say, like the crude Stalinist school of art, this idea that just by being a Marxist, you can look at any piece of art and know everything you need to know about it just by putting it in its historical context or whatever. But this is an arrogant view of art, and one that I would say actually insults dialectical materialism, which states and takes as an underlying key idea that the truth is always concrete. So to dive into an example of how at least one artistic movement has actually come to be, I want to talk about Romanticism. So this is an artistic movement which spanned from roughly the 1780s to the 1830s across all spheres of art, across multiple continents. It was extremely vast, but I'm going to focus mostly on Britain, where Romanticism took shape most clearly. Okay, so this movement was forged in the inferno of the British Industrial Revolution. This is when capitalism was entrenching itself into society, rapidly developing both the means of production and the working class needed to labor on them. But the working class didn't come into existence automatically or peacefully. It was dragged into existence kicking and screaming. The Enclosure Acts were used to expropriate commonly held land from the peasants in order to privatize it and force the peasants to go looking for work in the cities on threat of starvation. There, they found themselves in an industrial hellscape unlike anything they'd ever seen before. Suddenly, they did not work according to the seasons, the weather, or any of the natural rhythms of life. They now had to wake according to the clock and work according to the rhythm of the machine. You can imagine how deeply alienating this would feel, something like an apocalypse for the human spirit, not to be dramatic. But really, working conditions were brutal. Children started work around the age of 8, sometimes 5. And were often too disabled to work by adolescence, meaning that once they couldn't work anymore, there's often nothing left for them to do but die. So the average age of death for a worker in Bolton was 18, in Manchester 17, and in Liverpool 15. Women went to work often 3 to 4 days after giving birth, usually leaving their baby with a younger child, not yet working, or someone older who hadn't died yet. This was unmitigated, unmasked capital, heaving smoke into the sky, pouring sewage into the River Thames, and systematically consuming human life. In the relentless drive for profit, nothing was sacred, and this was the first major stimulus for Romanticism. But Romanticism was also deeply inspired by the French Revolution, which occurred during the youth of the most important Romantic artists. Through this revolution, they were promised something unthinkably better than the hell that actually materialized. When the centuries-old monarchy was toppled by the masses under the banner of freedom, equality, and fraternity, it electrified the people everywhere. They were filled with the hope of building a world guided by the inherent, inalienable rights of man and human reason. And for artists, there could be nothing more inspiring for their work. Shelley, for example, wrote a poem, The Song of Liberty, about the revolution, in which he imagines it as a grand celestial battle in which the forces of the new society vanquish the old. And he ends it with the line, "For everything that lives is holy." You really get the sense that these artists felt that they'd been given the chance to chronicle the rebirth of humanity. Instead, they found themselves chronicling its destruction and debasement. As Napoleon led a vicious reaction against the revolution, eventually bringing back the hated crown to place it on his own head, the main remnant of this great revolution was the economic order it instituted, capitalism, minus all of the grand promises of freedom. And it was this contradiction between what was promised and what came to be that provided the stimulus for a revolution in artistic form, especially in poetry, which I'll focus on. But because the Romantics had been given these great ideals and then found themselves in a world that completely contradicted them, this contradiction formed the stimulus for a revolution in form. So with their art, they needed some way to assert their humanity in an inhuman world. And they could not do it with the highly mannered and structured forms of classicism, which were dominant at the time. So these would be things like the epic or the elegy. The epic is meant for heroes' journeys, vast, sprawling stories with great battles and things like this. But what the Romantics wanted was something they could use to attest to their individuality, to assert that they were still human, that humanity still mattered, to go inward. And so to do it, they picked up a previously marginalized and unimportant poetic form, the lyric. Now, this is important because the lyric today is actually probably just what you would think of when you think of a poem. It's short, song-like, and focuses on the internal experience of the speaker. In the grand epics of the past, the inner life of the speaker was not a big part of the picture, but now it was the whole point, because that inner life, that humanity, is what artists felt society was destroying and disregarding. And one of the most important Romantic poets, Wordsworth, he gave a new definition to poetry in a famous manifesto that defined the movement. And there he stated that poetry is, quote, the powerful overflow of spontaneous feelings. This was new. And he urged poets to speak in plainer language, to focus on everyday life, small moments, to reject rigid forms, and to, above all, let their feelings guide them. And this conception of what poetry is changed the game so deeply that this is basically still our conception of what poetry is. Undoubtedly, the Romantics revolutionized artistic form, but yet politically, Romanticism had a powerful conservative streak. It was ultimately a pessimistic movement, lamenting what had happened to society and seeing no option other than to turn inward. Now, to show this, and because I don't think you can really truly appreciate the theory around this movement without getting at least a taste of the poetry, I'll read one of Wordsworth's most famous poems. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours, we've given our hearts away, a sordid boon. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan, suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. So the first few lines of this poem are obviously very much about capitalism, getting and spending, wasting our powers as humanity on this exchange and circulation of commodities, right? Then he kind of makes this escape into nature, and then finally actually an escape back into the past of antiquity. He says he'd rather have a creed outworn. He'd rather go back than be here, right? He's not calling for change or revolution. He is, if anything, calling to go backwards to a purer, more natural state. And this deep pessimism about the possibility of progress would eventually turn Wordsworth and other significant romantics into actual, real political conservatives. Coleridge, another important poet who worked with Wordsworth, he wrote, I have snapped my squeaking baby trumpet of sedition and have hung up its fragments in the chamber of penances. I wish to be a good man and a Christian, but I am no Whig, no reformist, no Republican. So this conservative streak is inherent to Romanticism and all its key themes. It really cannot be separated. I think this is important from the revolutionary streak within it. It's it is defined by its obsession with escaping from society into nature, escaping inwards, and it prioritizes feelings above the ideals of science and rationality, which helped to inspire the French Revolution. All of this was rejected by the Romantics. But this pessimism was not simply a result of the Romantics' individual world outlooks. It was a reflection of the particular balance of class forces at the time. Despite how quickly the working class was growing, despite how instantly radicalized it became and instantly began forming some kind of consciousness, still it was far too small and not organized enough to play a revolutionary role. It would not be until 1871 that the working class would take power for the first time and establish the Paris Commune. Until then, the way that things were, at least to most people, appeared to be the only way that they could be. This explains why the Romantics saw turning inward, seeking solace in oneself as the only option. It was, they wanted to make at least the page beautiful if life has to be so disgusting. Now, with the exception of a few courageous souls like Lord Byron, who died on his way to fight in the Greek War of Liberation from the Turks, most Romantics ended up literally going to the countryside and cloistering themselves away. Their poetry eventually suffered as they found themselves with nothing left to say. Wordsworth couldn't even finish his last big piece, one of the final lines being, "Work without hope draws nectar in a sieve, and hope without an object cannot live." And yet this instinctual desire to turn inward, to protect one's own individuality, though it is highly conservative when taken to its logical conclusion in politics, did play a revolutionary role in the sphere of art. It transformed how poets use language and laid the foundations for modern poetry. It would be unforgivable dogmatism to say that Romanticism was bad because it wasn't Marxist, or because it was based on the petty bourgeoisie instead of the working class, who in any case were in no condition to be making art. The point is to understand, and the fact is that due to the class balance of forces at the time, this viewpoint, this pessimism, and even this conservatism was inevitable. However, it would be fair to ask, where are today's romantics, or at least their equivalent? Where are the writers, poets, and artists pushing the boundaries of their craft to give voice to the burning questions of the day? You could find some people trying to do this, certainly, but I bet you'll find them working a day job at a grocery store. I bet when they get home from work every day, they tell themselves this is the night they'll finally put pen to paper, and then, night after night, find themselves too exhausted to think or feel in the way that art demands. These are not the conditions from which great art can come. This is why every great artistic movement under capitalism has come from a petty bourgeois social base. From Romanticism to modernism to postmodernism, you name it, a petty bourgeois social base is what made these movements possible. Because realistically, being petty bourgeois is the only way to dedicate yourself to art. But this class has been increasingly disappearing over the decades, becoming proletarianized. Now, the petty bourgeoisie is a heterogeneous class in between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So whereas workers are those who own nothing but their ability to labor, and the capitalists are those who own the means of production, the petty bourgeoisie is somewhere in between. And they sustain themselves off of their own work. They do some kind of work. But they do not do wage labor for a boss. So this would include artists who sustain themselves from their artistic production. Now, historically, artists have not usually been very rich. They've often been very poor. Obviously, there's the stereotype of the starving artist. But still, their social conditions gave them the physical and mental freedom to put everything they had into their art. And very importantly, it put them in touch with other people doing the same thing as them, other artists and intellectuals from whom they could take inspiration. And I think that's absolutely critical for shaping a new artistic movement. It doesn't really come out of just you in your dark, sad apartment at your laptop by yourself. For example, to kind of demonstrate the importance of this, of the petty bourgeoisie and their kind of social milieu, you'll have probably all heard of Picasso and Matisse, right? They're modernist painters who revolutionized visual art with their cubist or otherwise strange fragmented paintings, and their tradition led to surrealism and Dadaism and lots of other artistic forms. And there was a powerful historical impetus for this, which was essentially the carnage and irrationality of World War I. But for now, I just want to give you a taste of how they lived to show you how they were able to actually use this historical impetus as inspiration. So first of all, they were all basically gathered in one place in a shanty town in Paris of starving artists living together, going to the same cafes, observing each other's work all day, every day. You didn't really need money to go live there and do that. If you had like a little bit of money from a rich relative, probably good. The apartments were horrible, but dirt cheap. Artists also didn't spend most of their time there, but in cafes where, at least for the price of a coffee, you could just hang out all day, have at least a roof, a bathroom, and so on. And you would probably have some of the most cutting edge artists and philosophers coming through that cafe, and you can just talk to them all day, sharing ideas, debating, and so on. And because this was an option, there was a kind of feedback loop. The shanty town had a massive pull. Paris had a massive pull. The amount of important artists that cross paths there is mind-boggling. James Joyce, Josephine Baker, E. Cummings, Hemingway, as well as these famous artists you probably know, Picasso, Matisse, the list goes on. And many of them formed close relationships which fueled their work. For example, Picasso and his poet friends, I guess he preferred poets as friends. I don't know why anyone would do that. They were called the Picasso gang. But the point is, they did not have to do wage labor. They may have been semi-homeless vagabonds, but they were free to spend literally all of their time on art. It is almost impossible to live like this today. And I think this is a key reason that we have not seen new organic artistic movements bubbling up in many fields, because wage labor takes everything from us, leaving us very little to give to our own pursuits, and most people have to do wage labor. Even the professions that used to be petty bourgeois, professors and academics and so on, are becoming increasingly proletarianized. However, there is another important element that I think contributes to the stagnation in literature and art today, and that is a philosophical reason. So the petty bourgeoisie, being an in-between class with no cohesive and distinct interests of its own, tends to absorb the ideas of the ruling class unless it consciously breaks with them and sides with the working class, which can and does happen. But as Marx said, the ideas of the ruling class are in any epoch the ruling ideas. So, as the philosophy of the ruling class degrades and rots, this affects the petty bourgeoisie and its philosophy. The rise of the bourgeoisie was characterized by the promotion of science and reason, right, with the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, and in general defended the notion that we can learn about the world around us. But as capitalism entered into deeper and deeper crisis throughout its lifetime, the ruling class found that it was better, in fact necessary, to promote doubt instead of optimism about the strength of human reason. It was better to deny the very possibility of truth in order to cover up the very inconvenient truth that capitalism has nothing left to offer. And this is the basis for the rise of postmodernism, which argues that objective truth is completely impossible and all truth is subjective. In the arts, this is manifested in an endless deluge of pretentious garbage, with artists essentially asking the same questions over and over again. What is art really? Could art just be anything? Is a page of key smash letters a poem? Is a splatter of ketchup a painting? Is garbage a sculpture? This stuff is meant to be subversive, but it's mostly just empty because it's not responding to any new question really posed by society, but just the same questions that have been in vogue among academic circles for decades and decades, since at least the 90s for sure, but it started brewing even before that. And I think it's an empty parody of the actually subversive modernist art which followed World War I. And also attempted to ask the question, what is art? But here it was responding to, of course, the carnage and destruction of the Great War. So, for example, Duchamp, a modernist painter in 1919, took a urinal, he wrote "Our Mutt" on it, and he titled the piece "Fountain." It was supposed to be displayed at the Grand Central Palace in New York, but everyone involved in the exhibition hated it. They didn't let him do it, and it caused a big, big stir. But it became known as a landmark work and a major inspiration for other experimental artists. Duchamp would become involved in the Dadaist movement, which saw this unprecedented destruction of World War I, and asked in this context, what can art be anymore? What role does beauty and meaning have in the midst of this senselessness? The Dadaists were quite political as well. They were fervent supporters of the Russian and German revolutions, and in a declaration they called for the international revolutionary union of all creative and intellectual men and women on the basis of radical communism. It should be noted that they were very philosophically eclectic. I would not call these people consistent, principled Marxists. But the point is they were tapped in to the struggles taking place around them, and they were genuinely attempting to respond to it with their art. And they felt the only thing to do with art in a world of such senselessness was to desecrate it as a statement against the capitalist desecration of human life, right? And also as, to respond, or rather to destroy the mythology that capitalism promotes about itself, that it promotes reason and progress and things like this. There's basically a big FU to the entire system. But compare Duchamp's Fountain, which I don't think you have to say is like an incredible work of art, but it made a mark. Compare that to a piece called Catalan's Comedian. You've probably all seen it, actually. It's a banana duct taped to the wall. The artist did claim he was doing this to make fun of the absurdity of the art world and all this, but when it sold for $6.2 million to a crypto investor, the reaction was not shock and this is so radical and scandalous. It was, for the reaction from the public was mostly just disgust. Again, not out of shock, but because we see this kind of waste of money all of the time. $6.2 million for a banana in a world where millions starve to death every day. It's disgusting, and it also just seems to be more of the same, right? It's exactly the kind of thing we're completely used to. It's not subversive. So postmodernism is not really asking any question about art, because to ask a question seriously, you have to believe that there could be an answer. You have to believe in such a thing as truth. But postmodernism rejects this, and so much of its art is just an assertion that art can be anything, that there's no such thing as a universal truth, no such thing as great art, and so on. And it's no wonder the public, and certainly the working class, just doesn't care about what's going on in so-called high art. They're not scandalized or too dumb to get it. They are bored. And in fact, I think there is a powerful thirst for iconoclasts in art, someone to come and actually stand for something, right? To actually be subversive. Being ironic and cynical and just shitting on the very concept of art is not subversive anymore. Think of the Kendrick-Drake feud, okay? I know that on one level, this was a feud between two individuals, both of whom are very rich, probably hoping to get success on the charts. But to, I would say, the general public, to the working class as well, many felt that Kendrick was really using Drake as a symbol of everything he sees as wrong with hip-hop and the music industry in general, prioritizing success on the charts over artistic expression, misogyny, and the way that artists like Drake pretended to have gone through stuff they just haven't gone through to seem, to give themselves street cred or something. And this resonated with people, that Kendrick was taking down, I would say again, not really just this individual, but this symbol of all of the rot in the music industry. And I think that's why Kendrick undoubtedly won the feud with the culture, right? I think that shows something important, that what really touched people and felt daring was the conviction, as opposed to all of the corporate hollowness that's out there, even if it is maybe a conviction that comes from, in some way, personal beef or a desire to rise on the charts, whatever. It was conviction nonetheless. So my point is not to tell you that Kendrick is the new Beethoven or whatever. It'll save my personal opinions. The point is, people resonated with someone trying to speak the truth. Kendrick's success brought up another question, though. Could he or any artist actually provoke some kind of change or even revolution within society as a whole? At the Super Bowl halftime show, he said the revolution was about to be televised. So this got a lot of people talking. Can art make a revolution? People are even really demanding that Kendrick go further and, add more, like talk about more, talk about Palestine, right? Take a stand on this, take a stand on that. I think there was this powerful and I would say understandable thirst for him to actually be a revolutionary, which I have to say, that's completely understandable from the masses, right? Who are desperate to see that represented somewhere. But we have to say for ourselves as Marxists, putting political demands on art doesn't work for convincing people of your political program, and it also doesn't work for making good art. Art can have its own revolutions, and artists can put themselves on the side of revolution, but art has never and will never make a revolution. And in fact, when artists try to turn their art into a tool of revolutionary propaganda, just to do so, it makes for not very good art. It's one thing if an artist is genuinely struck by inspiration from a movement, like Shelley's poem about the French Revolution, but it's another that they're trying to beat you over the head with a political program. It displaces all artistic concerns in favor of political ones, and at the same time, again, it's not going to achieve the desired effect of convincing people anyways. Clunky, didactic art is not going to convince anyone to join the revolution. 1 second. So art won't save us. In fact, what's needed is a revolution to save art. The feeling of general stagnation in culture is the result of capitalism's deep terminal decline. Nothing has really gotten better for decades. Nobody feels hopeful because nobody has a reason to. But unlike other dark periods, for example, World War I, artistic movements don't even exist to respond to it anymore. We are left mostly with a constant stream of content, bright colors and flashing lights to distract us while the world burns. But despite what the capitalists who control our culture think, the working class is human, and humans are conscious beings who cannot help but search for meaning, truth, and beauty, and we do this in all circumstances. Frederick Douglass was an enslaved black man who was taught to read in secret, escaped slavery, and wrote the incredible autobiography of a slave. Workers in Russia taught one another to read, not just so that they could understand Marxist theory, but also so they could access the world of culture that had been locked away from them. And the people of Gaza, in the middle of a genocide, painted murals on the rubble. You cannot take the desire for creation out of humanity. But this doesn't mean that culture will survive and develop no matter what. We know that there are periods in history where knowledge and art has been thrown back centuries with just bits left over to build from. These bits of Greek culture, for example, were the building blocks of the Renaissance. But before the Renaissance, there were years of deep stagnation where all of culture was within the heavy vice grip of the church. Revolution is the only way to prevent something like this. Culture means nothing to the ruling class. They do not care. Long gone are the days when they promoted revolutionary developments in any sphere of life. They cannot see beyond the next financial quarter, and they don't care what slop they feed us if it makes money. Their idea of life is honestly perverted and inhuman. We don't have to live in their world forever, though. The working class has more than enough power to save human culture for the generations before us. And it's not just about preserving it. A world socialist revolution would unleash artistic revolutions on a scale humanity has never seen before. Of course, it wouldn't happen overnight. We will have to find our voice. We will have to assimilate the gains of the past and grapple with totally new questions, the outlines of which we can only guess at today. But eventually, after centuries of being voiceless, it will finally be our turn to speak. And when we do, not only can we promote revolutions in all spheres of art, but we can also take conscious control over all of culture, over everything that exists and everything that is human. We could expunge the rot from all corners of life and begin to consciously shape all of culture. Imagine a world with no advertisements. Imagine an internet actually usable for finding information, learning things, and connecting with people that's not constantly shoving garbage AI summaries in your face. Imagine buildings constructed for use and beauty, not infills, which I hate ugly infills, just for profit. If we, the working class, could take control of all these areas of life, we could make all of it artful. That is to say, everything we do could be done with intention, consciousness, creativity, and beauty. The first steps in this direction were taken by the Soviet Union to through the power of the collective masses to exert a positive and conscious influence on all areas of culture. Trotsky even considered the smallest details of all aspects of everyday life to think about how the working class in power could improve them. Even things like using respectful language, right? Discouraging degrading language left over from class society. This would actually be possible to achieve. There would be nothing in culture that we could not take under the conscious control of the people through the power of the people. That's what we're fighting for. We don't just want to extend the bare existence of the working class. We want lives worth living. Because in a very real way, we were made for more than this. The fact that we exist, that we are matter made conscious of itself, is, in the atheist sense, a miracle. We can think, we can learn, we can create, and capitalism squanders this for what? For good quarterly financial reports. It's sick. We were made for so much more. We deserve so much more, and we can have it if we take it for ourselves. And so I'll give the last words to Trotsky, a man who, as he was speeding around Russia in a Red Army train, fighting to make that world possible, always had time to read a good book. Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full.